never quit on your athlete, right? That's one of the things we see with parents sometimes, that they become frustrated with their athlete's progression. And so they give up. Only make a policy you're willing to enforce 100% of the time. What are the standards you want to set at the beginning of the season, and make sure everyone understands those critical components that are going to get everyone rowing in the same direction, so you can start the season off on the best foot forward. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cheer Biz podcast. I'm your host, Dan Cotton, and today we are talking about what standards are important to set at the beginning of a season. Now, before we get into the episode, head on over to Cheer Gym Owners on Facebook if you're a gym owner, and join that group, and All-Star Cheer Coaches and Owners if you are a coach or a coach and owner, and make sure you're in that Facebook group. A lot of the questions that inspire the podcast come from those groups, and then I talk about them more on the podcast. Check out nextgenowners.com to learn more about how to join the Academy, and you want to make sure that you're joining the Academy prior to our conference in Dallas, if you can, June 21st through the 23rd. If you're not registered for conference and you're not in the Academy yet, you got to get to conference. It's going to be absolutely fantastic, and you are not going to want to miss it. Now, this question of what standards are important to set at the beginning of a season was asked by my dear friend, Callie Seitzer, and she actually asked this on ASGA. And it was just a general question of what standards do you set within your gym? And I thought, man, that's such a great question and such an important one to talk about right now as we all get ready to head into our start of our new season. And I was actually just talking to someone on the phone about this. It's such a weird time because I'm 3 weeks out to leaving for Worlds, but also getting ready to start the next season. And we'll have our first tryout prior to D2 Summit, our first evaluation. And so there's a lot of things in the air. So we're ending one season, starting another banquet. There's so many different things to be planning for and preparing for. And it can be kind of overwhelming. So I think it's important to take some time and diligently plan what it is we should be talking about and what standards we should be setting with our athletes and our parents heading into a new season. So number one, first and foremost, is you need to be setting the standard of what your gym's core values are and why they matter. And you need to be doing this at all levels, at the level of your athletes, at the level of your parents, and at the level of your coaches. And they all need to understand what the core values are and how they, in their role in the facility, can carry out those core values. This is the hardest to do with parents, right? We have 5 core values in our gym, and one of those values is no excuses, no regrets. Well, how does that relate to a parent? May not be as simple and obvious as we may think. Now, for me, I'd say, well, no excuses and no regrets directly would relate to making sure your athlete attends practices and not having regrets about decisions that you make that negatively impact your athlete's progression or the team's progression. But your parents may not fully understand that. Or maybe you have one that is never quit. Well, that's one of ours. And that's much more about, failing forward and being willing to make mistakes. But parents may not understand what never quit means. It may seem like just a ploy of never quit cheerleading, keep paying us money. And that's really not what it's about, right? It's never quit on your athlete, right? That's one of the things we see with parents sometimes, that they become frustrated with their athlete's progression. And so they give up. They stop caring. They stop wanting to watch practices or watch their athlete in their private lessons or bring them to additional training because the athlete isn't progressing in the way they want. And then they end up quitting, in air quotes, on that athlete. So communicating those core values to your parents and helping them understand how they fit is equally as important as communicating it to your athletes as it is communicating it to your staff and how they need to live out those core values in your gym and have that standard. Our next standard that we want to be setting early on in the year is our attendance policies. Now, this is a somewhat complex one. In fact, I just had a long conversation with our Elevate group, our highest tier owners, about setting attendance policies and what it is everyone does within their gym. And you need to set your what your policy is ahead of time. And then you need to make sure that everyone understands, from athlete to parent to coaches, what that policy is and how that impacts them. And there's a reason for this. It is important that everyone on the chain is aware of what the policy is, understands how it's enforced, and understands how their role fits within that policy. Now, this seems really, really obvious, but it actually can get very nuanced, because if you have not clearly communicated your policy to your parents, they may not understand what the expectations are. Additionally, if you haven't clearly communicated the policy and the repercussions of missing practice to your coaches, they may go off script and create their own consequences and their own punishments. So the next thing you know, you're getting a phone call from angry parent who's like, why did you make my daughter do all of this extra conditioning when within your policy that shouldn't have happened? And you, as the owner, weren't aware because the coach took it upon themselves to create a consequence for the athlete missing practice. And that doesn't align with what you've communicated. So you need to make sure that everyone in that process is aware of what your attendance policy is, how it is enforced, how you are going to track it, and what are going to be the consequences, if any, of missing practices. Now, my just 2 quick cents on attendance policies in general is only make a policy you're willing to enforce 100% of the time. So if you say something like, if you miss practice during a blackout week for any reason, you will be removed from competition. Then what are you going to do when your superstar point flyer is sick and misses practice? Now, can you have a policy that says, with the exception of or at the owner's discretion? Yes, you can. And I highly encourage you to have those kind of caveats in there so you can make a nuanced decision. When you make a black and white statement of if this, then this, then you need to be willing to follow through with that very black and white statement. And sometimes I can tell you as a coach, I'm not going to do that because life is nuanced. Life has complicated factors and facets. And there are times where I'm not going to pull an athlete out of a competition just because they missed, even if they miss the day before, because it's going to be harder for me to train a new athlete to take that spot than it is to just keep the athlete who was sick or had a band concert or something like that that was unavoidable prior to an event. Number 3 would be to convey very clearly to everyone involved, parents, athletes, and coaches, what are your payment policies? Now, oftentimes these things are left for contracts, meaning read the contract, sign the contract, and that's the only time we talk about our payment policies. But I think it is really important to verbally be upfront about your payment policies with everyone. And actually adding in athletes to the mix is something that I'm going to do this year for all of my teams. Now, are they going to remember? No, not necessarily. But if I tell everyone at the beginning of the season, when everything is rainbows and sunshine and people are happy and people have paid their bills and everyone's excited about the season, and I let everyone know, coaches, parents, and athletes, hey, if you are more than 1 week late on a payment, you will be sitting out. And I communicate that to everyone. Then when that happens, the athlete, the parent, and the coach are not surprised. Now, you're going to get downward pressure from your coaches to keep athletes in the routine, even though they haven't paid, because, well, I really, really need them. And I get that. I'm a competitive coach. I totally understand the need factor, but you need to also make sure that you're setting a standard and you're clearly and consistently applying that standard. I think it is good to let athletes know, hey, if your bill is past due, I know you don't pay it, but if your bill is past due, that means that you might be sitting out a little bit, and it's not your fault. It's just something that your mom and your dad in the gym have to figure out. Now, some people would say, well, kids don't need to know that. Well, ultimately, that kid is the one who's going to bear the consequence if you have to pull them out for the season because their parents are a month behind. So I think being open and honest and upfront is the best way to approach that. And it is good to clearly set at the beginning of the season. The last one would be your social media policies. If you are going to have policies in place that regulate the way athletes conduct themselves on social media, be it photos, comments, interactions with other athletes or other gyms, those kind of things. You want to clearly convey that at the beginning of the season, again, to coaches, athletes, and parents, and make sure everyone knows exactly what that standard is. So when there are consequences or there are repercussions of actions, everyone is well aware and previously informed of what will happen if X, Y, and Z occurs. These are important policies to have in place because kids make mistakes. Now, again, do I recommend you have a really strict social media policy that says if you post a picture that we disagree with, then you have to take it down and you're going to be kicked off of your team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? No, I don't. I think you need to be nuanced and realize that we are mentors to children, and that is our job, is to teach them how to be great people and teach them how to be contributing members of society and clearly communicate that social media policy to them. You also, if you have a social media policy for your staff, you need to make sure that is communicated to them as well, so they know what their expectations are for what they are doing and engaging in on social media. If you want your team to be the best it can be, you need to all be rowing in the same direction. And this is why getting on the same page of standards at the beginning of the season will get you rowing in the same direction. This is why you need to have these conversations, so everyone knows the destination and the steps that it's going to take to get there, as opposed to keeping these things behind closed doors or not clearly conveying them to people. You want to be out front, ahead of the game, communicating to your parents, to your athletes, to your coaches, what the standards are and how it is they'll be enforced. So as you leave the podcast, if you have gotten something out of it, hopefully you've been taking notes. If not, as you end the podcast, take some time and create your list. What do you want to make sure that you cover with your families, your athletes, your parents, your coaches, and your additional staff, anyone involved? What are the standards you want to set at the beginning of the season, and make sure everyone understands those critical components that are going to get everyone rowing in the same direction, so you can start the season off on the best foot forward. These are the things that you don't want people to miss out on. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, share it with someone who would get something out of it. Listen to the other episodes we partner with, the Let's Talk Cheer podcast, the Cheer Mom podcast, both fantastic podcasts to be listening to. And with that, we'll catch you on the next episode.